Sarah Gear. For more than 40 years, the person who took a teenager's life left behind only a DNA profile that matched no one. Then, a single discarded cigarette changed everything. Sarah Gear was a teenager living in Cloverdale in Sonoma County, California. On an evening in May of 1982, she left a friend's house and never made it home. She was attacked in a secluded spot near an apartment building, and her body was found the next morning by a firefighter walking home after his shift. A girl who had simply gone out to see a friend was gone, and a quiet town was left reeling. There were no witnesses, no suspect, and no obvious motive, only the sudden, shocking absence of a teenager who should have been home. How could something like this happen in a small town and leave no trace of who was responsible? The Cloverdale Police Department investigated, but 1982 forensic science could only do so much. In 2003, a state criminalist developed a DNA profile from evidence in the case, but it matched no one in any law enforcement database. The profile was a complete genetic fingerprint of the killer, and yet it pointed to no name at all. Investigators had the who, in a sense, without knowing who. It was a frustrating kind of progress, a perfect clue that led nowhere because the man it belonged to had never been entered into the system. The case went cold and stayed that way for decades, passed from one generation of detectives to the next. For nearly 40 years, the file sat as one of the most painful unsolved cases in the county. Detectives who were not even born when it happened would later inherit it, study the same evidence, and reach the same wall. The DNA was there, complete and waiting, but the tools to trace it simply did not exist yet. What good is a perfect piece of evidence if there is no one to compare it against? That changed in 2021 when Cloverdale police brought in a private investigator named Kevin Kline and enlisted the FBI to try investigative genetic genealogy. Rather than searching for an exact match, the technique builds family trees from distant relatives who share fragments of DNA, then narrows inward until only one person fits. It had already cracked other long, cold cases around the country, and Cloverdale investigators hoped it could do the same here. The promise was simple but powerful. Even a killer who had never been arrested could be found through the DNA of cousins and distant kin who had. The FBI concluded the DNA belonged to one of 4 brothers and focused on a man named James Oliver Unick. The science had narrowed a whole world of possible suspects down to a single family, and then to one name. Agents watched Unick and collected a cigarette he had discarded, and the DNA on it matched the profile from the case. A single cigarette butt had closed a gap that had stood for nearly 40 years. It was a quiet, almost ordinary moment. A discarded item picked up off the ground that finally connected a name to the evidence. Unick was arrested at his home in Willows, California, in July of 2024. After more than 4 decades, the genetic fingerprint from 1982 finally had a face. Could a case that old really hold up in front of a jury? On the 13th of February, 2026, a date that would have been Sarah's birthday, a Sonoma County jury convicted James Oliver Unick, 64, of murder with a special circumstance tied to the assault. The jury deliberated only about 2 hours before reaching its verdict. At trial, Unick offered an account of that night that the jury firmly rejected. He faces life without the possibility of parole. The verdict arrived on what should have been a milestone birthday, a coincidence that was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. The district attorney called it the coldest case ever presented to a Sonoma County jury. 44 years after a teenager left a friend's house and never came home, The man responsible finally had a name and a verdict. The DNA profile that had sat unmatched since 2003 had, in the end, outlasted the killer's freedom. The next case would unfold thousands of miles to the north, where another trail had stayed cold through decades of Alaska winters. Shelley Connolly. A teenage girl spent her last evening at an Anchorage bar, talking with a group of young men. For more than 4 decades, no one knew which of them had taken her life. Shelley Connolly was a teenager in Anchorage, Alaska, remembered by her mother as petite, spunky, a girl who loved to roller skate and have sleepovers. She was, by her family's account, a typical teen who occasionally bent the rules, a bright presence whose absence left a permanent hole. Her mother would spend the next 4 decades making sure the world did not forget her. On a January night in 1978, she was last seen alive inside a well-known Anchorage bar, talking with several young men. Her body was later found near the railroad tracks along the Seward Highway by 2 people who had stopped to take scenic photographs, and she had died of her injuries. The 2 had stopped to photograph the landscape and instead made a haunting discovery. One ordinary night out had ended in a place no one would have thought to look. For a family expecting her home, the hours of not knowing gave way to the worst kind of certainty. Who had she left that bar with, and why did no one ever come forward? Alaska state troopers developed a DNA profile from evidence collected at the time, but for decades, it matched no one. For years, investigators searched for a man known only by a nickname, Pinky. But that trail led nowhere. The single nickname was almost all they had, and it was not enough. Shelley's mother, Judy Connolly, refused to let the case be forgotten, keeping it in the public eye through a long media campaign. Year after year, she pushed for answers that never came, while the evidence sat waiting for a science that did not yet exist. How do you find one man in a crowd of strangers, decades after the fact? In 2018, a cold case investigator named Randy McFerrin read about genetic genealogy and decided to try it on Shelley's case. It was the same kind of approach that had recently led to a breakthrough in the high-profile Golden State Killer case. And it offered a fresh way forward for evidence that had gone nowhere for 40 years. Instead of waiting for the suspect to be arrested for something else and entered into a database, the method worked outward through his relatives. Evidence was submitted late that year, and by June of 2019, a search of a public DNA database had identified a relative of the suspect, narrowing the field to 3 brothers. The trail led to Donald McQuaid of Gresham, Oregon, who had been 21 at the time and had never once been a suspect. For more than 40 years, he had lived an ordinary life, unconnected in anyone's mind to a teenager left by the tracks in Alaska. The man investigators had hunted under a single nickname had been hiding in plain sight 1,000 miles away, living quietly in another state under his own name. Gresham police collected 2 cigarette butts McQuaid discarded, and the DNA matched evidence from the case. It was the same quiet, patient method that worked in other genealogy cases, following a person until they left behind something carrying their DNA. No dramatic confrontation, just careful surveillance and a discarded item. He was arrested in August of 2019. A man who had been a stranger to the case for 4 decades was suddenly its central figure. Would a jury convict on a case more than 40 years old? In December of 2023, an Anchorage jury convicted McQuaid of murder. In April of 2024, a judge sentenced him, then 67, to 50 years in prison. McQuaid maintained his innocence and said he would appeal, and his attorney noted he was in remission from advanced cancer. For Judy Connolly, who had spent most of her life demanding answers, The conviction was the resolution she had pushed for across more than 4 decades. The nickname, the dead-end leads, the long silence, all of it had finally given way to a name and a sentence. A case that had once seemed destined to stay open forever had reached an Anchorage courtroom and ended in a conviction. The next case would trade the Alaskan cold for the heat of the Nevada desert, where a teenager disappeared in the middle of an ordinary morning. Kim Bryant. A teenager called her boyfriend for a ride and waited across the street from her school. By the time he arrived, she had vanished in broad daylight. Kim Bryant was a teenager connected to Western High School in Las Vegas, Nevada. To the people who knew her, she had a whole life ahead of her, plans and a future cut short on a single ordinary day. On a January morning in 1979, she called her boyfriend and asked him to pick her up at a Dairy Queen across from the school. When he arrived a short time later, she was gone, taken from a busy roadway with no witnesses. The gap between her phone call and his arrival had been only minutes, and in that small window, she had vanished completely. A street that should have been full of people going about their day had somehow swallowed her without a trace. Her body was found in a shallow desert grave a few weeks later. The bright, ordinary morning, the call for a ride, the short wait by a fast food restaurant, all of it had ended in the desert outside the city. How does a teenager disappear in daylight on a busy street with no one seeing a thing? At first, police suspected she had run away and were slow to treat her as missing. That early assumption cost precious time in the most critical hours, when a fast response might have made a difference. Detectives later focused on 2 young men, but those leads went nowhere. Biological evidence recovered at the time could not be identified with the science of the day. Even a round of DNA testing in 2008 failed to produce a usable profile. For more than 4 decades, the answer sat just out of reach, locked inside a sample the technology could not yet read. Detectives knew the evidence held the truth. They simply had no way to unlock it. What would it take to finally pull a name from evidence that old? In 2021, a profile was finally developed, but it still matched no one in the national database. The case needed more than a database search, and it needed a way to find people who had never been entered into one. Funded by a donation from a Las Vegas philanthropist, police sent the evidence to a Texas company called Othram, which specializes in building genealogical profiles from difficult, degraded samples. It was the kind of private lab work that had begun to transform cold cases nationwide, squeezing usable data out of samples that older methods would have written off as useless. Working through family trees, investigators narrowed the search to a relative who provided a DNA sample. That one relative's sample was enough to point straight at a name. The same science that had reopened cold cases across the country was now closing in on the man who had eluded Las Vegas detectives since 1979. The work identified Johnny Blake Peterson, 19 at the time, a Las Vegas resident who had briefly attended the same school. He had been close enough to cross paths with her, yet had never once surfaced in the original investigation. For more than 40 years, his name had simply never come up, not in the early interviews, not on any suspect list. Police announced the identification in November of 2021. Would the family finally get their day in court? Peterson, however, would never face a courtroom. He had died in 1993. He had once been arrested in a separate case that was later dismissed. A brush with the system that, at the time, led nowhere and left no record connecting him to anything. His death meant that the identification, however certain, would never be tested in front of a jury. Kim's father had described her as a beautiful girl with a bright future. Her mother had died the year before the identification, without ever learning who was responsible. The answer had come, but for some of those who needed it most, it had arrived too late. Still, after more than 40 years, the family at last had a name to attach to their loss. The teenager who had vanished waiting for a ride was no longer a question without an answer, even if it had come decades too late for justice. The next case would return to California, where a strange phone call had once steered investigators away from the truth. Esther Gonzalez. A teenager set out to walk to her sister's house and never arrived. The man who reported finding her body would not be identified for another 45 years. Esther Gonzalez was a teenager from Beaumont, in Riverside County, California. On a February day in 1979, she set out walking from her parents' home toward her sister's home in nearby Banning and was attacked along the way. Her body was found the next day off a highway south of Banning. A short, familiar walk between two family homes had turned into the last trip she ever made. She had set out in daylight on a route she knew well, expecting nothing more than an ordinary afternoon with her sister. How does a teenager vanish on a route she had walked 100 times before? Investigators learned of the body only after an agitated man called the sheriff's station to report it, saying he did not even know whether the person was male or female. It was a strange, unsettling call, the kind that should have pointed straight at its source. A man who claimed not to know what he was even looking at had somehow known exactly where to find it. Within days, investigators identified the caller as a man named Louis Randolph Williamson. If the caller knew where the body was, why was he not the obvious suspect? Williamson agreed to a polygraph in 1979, passed it, and was cleared. On the strength of that test, the man who had led police to the scene was set aside. His odd phone call treated as nothing more than that of a shaken passerby. A biological sample from the case was later entered into the National DNA database, but it produced no match. The case went cold, and the man who had called it in quietly faded from view, his name buried in an old file for decades. Investigators had crossed him off early, and there was nothing in the science of the time to bring him back. How could the one person who led police to the scene slip away for so long? In 2023, the county's cold case team partnered with Othram, which used advanced genome sequencing to build a genealogical profile from the evidence. It was the same family tree approach that had cracked cold cases across the country, applied now to a case that had defeated investigators for more than 40 years. Rather than waiting for a direct database match that might never come, the team traced the genetic trail through distant relatives. The family tree led straight back to Williamson, who had died in Florida in 2014. The genealogy had circled back to the very man who had once dialed the sheriff himself. A blood sample taken during his autopsy was compared to the crime scene DNA, and it matched. The man who had called in the body, passed a polygraph, and walked away had been the answer all along. The lie detector test that cleared him in 1979 had, in the end, only delayed the truth. Authorities announced the identification in November of 2024. What else might a man like that have done in the years he stayed free? Othram noted the case was the 50th in California to be solved using its technology, a marker of how quickly the approach was reshaping cold case work across the state. Because Williamson is dead, there will be no prosecution, and investigators have asked the public for information about any other possible victims. The fact that he had stayed free for so long, never charged and never watched, left open the unsettling question of what else those decades might have held. Her brother had gone to high school with a man who turned out to be responsible, a detail that made the answer feel even closer to home. A familiar face hidden in plain sight for decades. For her family, the identification brought a name and a measure of certainty, even if the courtroom reckoning they might have wanted was no longer possible. After 45 long years, the question of who had taken Esther finally had an answer, even as new questions about him remained unanswered. The next case would involve not one young victim, but two. Best friends whose disappearance had haunted a Florida community for almost 50 years. Barbara Schreiber and Darlene Zetterauer. Two best friends had just finished 8th grade when they climbed into a stranger's van. They were never seen alive again. Barbara Schreiber and Darlene Zetterauer were teenagers and best friends in Hollywood, Florida, who had just finished middle school. They had reached the end of one chapter of childhood and were looking ahead to the next, the way any pair of close friends does at that age. On a June day in 1975, days after receiving their report cards, the two were seen getting into a white van with two men. It was the last time they were seen alive. Two friends who had spent the day like any other had stepped into a vehicle that would carry them out of their own lives. Their bodies were found the next morning by a family on a fishing trip along a canal at the edge of the Everglades. Two girls who had just closed out the school year side by side were gone together in a single night. They had been inseparable in life, and they were found together at the end of it. How do two friends vanish at once in daylight and then leave a community with no answers? The double case went cold for decades, despite the work of dozens of investigators over the years. Generations of detectives looked at the same files and the same canal and came away with nothing they could prove. Tips came and went. Suspects were considered and discarded, and still the two friends had no justice. The Broward Sheriff's Office created a full-time cold case unit in 2019 and turned back to the evidence that had been preserved for nearly half a century. Among that evidence was clothing that had been carefully kept since the 1970s, waiting for a method that could read what it still held. Could decades-old clothing still hold the answer after all this time? Unlike most cases of its kind, this one was cracked not by genealogy, but by a newer DNA collection method, a wet vacuum system that can pull genetic material trapped deep in the fibers of fabric. The clothing had been handled and stored for decades, yet the method could recover what older techniques had missed entirely. A crime scene detective used it on Darlene's preserved clothing and developed a full suspect profile. That profile matched a known offender, and in August of 2023, investigators named the first suspect, Robert Clark Keebler. After nearly 50 years, one of the two men in the van finally had a name. The clothing that had been packed away since the 1970s had given up the one clue investigators needed most. Who was the second man? In May of 2025, applying a new technique that produced a complete profile for one man and a partial for the other, the office named the second suspect, Lawrence Stein. Both men had long criminal histories that stretched across several states. They had been hiding in plain sight in the records all along, never connected to the two girls until the science finally caught up. Two names that had meant nothing to the case for half a century were suddenly at its center. Both men had moved through the criminal justice system over the years, yet nothing had ever tied them to that June night, until the clothing was finally tested with a method capable of reading it. Why, after all that, would there still be no trial? Neither man could be brought to trial, though. Keebler had died in 2019, and Stein in 2005. The science had arrived too late to put either of them in front of a judge. Prosecutors agreed, Both would have been charged had they lived, and the case was formally cleared. It was a resolution without a trial, the strange new kind of closure these cold case breakthroughs so often deliver. Investigators also ruled out a link some had suspected to another infamous local case. After 50 years, the families finally had two names, even if a courtroom verdict was beyond reach. The two girls who had been found together at the edge of the Everglades were, at last, no longer a mystery without a culprit. Even if the courtroom that should have judged those two men never got the chance. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case would make history, becoming the first of its kind ever to reach a courtroom and end in a conviction. Tanya van Keulenborg. A teenage couple set out on an overnight trip and never came home. The case would sit unsolved for 30 years before a brand new kind of science cracked it open. Tanya van Keulenborg and her boyfriend Jay Cook were young sweethearts from Saanich, British Columbia. They were the kind of young couple with their whole lives ahead of them, trusted by their families to make a short trip on their own. In November of 1987, the two crossed into Washington State on an overnight trip to pick up parts for Jay's father's business. They took a ferry from Canada and a second ferry toward Seattle, and were last seen boarding that crossing. Within days, both had been found, killed, and left in separate rural locations, and the family van was recovered nearby. A simple errand across the border had turned into a sudden double tragedy that shook two whole countries. Two families on opposite sides of the line spent the next 30 years waiting for an answer that never seemed to come. Every anniversary passed without an arrest. How could two young people vanish on a routine trip and leave investigators with nothing? The case went cold for more than 3 decades, with no witness, no weapon, and no clear suspect. DNA evidence left by the killer had been recovered and preserved, but for years it matched no one in any database. The profile was complete, yet the man it belonged to remained a ghost. Detectives across 2 jurisdictions inherited the file, studied it, and ran into the same wall. The couple's families spent those decades without answers, living with a loss that had no name attached to it. What could finally turn that anonymous profile into a name? A Snohomish County cold case detective named Jim Scharf, inspired by the Golden State Killer case, sent the DNA to a company called Parabon Nanolabs. That earlier case had just shown the world that a killer could be found through the DNA of relatives who had never been suspects. And Scharf wanted to try the same idea here. The firm uploaded a profile to a public database and brought in genetic genealogist C.C. Moore in what was her first criminal case. The approach was still brand new at the time, and few people knew whether it would hold up to the scrutiny of a courtroom. Working from distant cousin matches on both the maternal and paternal sides of the suspect's family, she traced the trees inward until they converged on a single man, William Earl Talbot II. 2 separate branches of a family tree had pointed at the same person, and that overlap was the answer. Talbot, a truck driver, had lived only a few miles from where Jay's body was found. Police followed him and recovered a cup that fell from his truck. The DNA on it matched the crime scene profile, and he was arrested in May of 2018. A man who had stayed invisible for 30 years was suddenly the prime suspect. Could a case built on this untested science survive a trial? In June of 2019, a jury convicted Talbot on 2 counts of aggravated murder, making it the first case in the world solved by this genealogy method to reach a jury and end in a conviction. He was sentenced to 2 life terms without parole. It was a landmark, the moment a brand new technique proved it could carry a case all the way from a crime scene to a verdict. Prosecutors and genealogists around the country watched closely, knowing the result would shape how the method was used everywhere else. The conviction was briefly overturned on appeal over a question of juror bias. But in December of 2022, the Washington Supreme Court reinstated it in a unanimous decision. The reversal had briefly thrown the historic result into doubt, raising the possibility that the first genealogy conviction might be undone on a technicality. A later appeals ruling affirmed the convictions once more. The verdict had been tested again and again, and each time it held. Talbot remains in the Washington state prison system. The science that had seemed so new in 2018 had now been validated in the highest court in the state, opening the door for hundreds of cold cases that would follow. The next case would move south to Texas, where a young woman vanished from a parking lot after a Valentine's dance. Carla Walker. A teenager was taken from a car in a bowling alley parking lot while her boyfriend lay unconscious beside her. It would take 46 years to learn who did it. Her case would become one of the most cited examples of how far DNA science had come and how patient a cold case team had to be to use it. Carla Walker was a teenager and a high school cheerleader in Fort Worth, Texas, remembered by those who knew her as a funny, lively spitfire who dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. In the early hours of a February night in 1974, after a Valentine's dance, she and her boyfriend stopped at a bowling alley parking lot when a man wrenched open the car door. Her boyfriend was knocked unconscious, and Carla was taken. She was held for a few days, and her body was found in a culvert near a lake. What had begun as a happy night, a Valentine's dance with friends, had ended in a way no one could have imagined. Her boyfriend survived, but the questions of who had done this and why would hang over the family for the rest of their lives. How does a young woman disappear from a crowded night out with her boyfriend right there beside her? A man named Glenn Samuel McCurley was an early person of interest, because a piece of evidence at the scene was tied to a gun like the one he owned. For a moment in 1974, investigators had the right man within reach and did not know it. He sat among their early suspects and then walked away clean. But he claimed the gun had been stolen, passed a polygraph, and was set aside. It was the kind of early clue that should have led somewhere and instead led nowhere for decades. The lie detector result that cleared him would later look like one of the great missed turns of the investigation. Evidence had been carefully preserved, including material on Carla's clothing, but the technology of the 1970s could do nothing with it. The case went cold for nearly half a century, outliving detectives and witnesses alike. Could decades-old evidence still hold a usable trace of the killer? After the case was featured on a true crime television program, investigators connected with Othram, a Texas company that specializes in building genealogical profiles from challenging samples. The connection came at the right moment, just as the technology had matured enough to handle evidence this old and this degraded. A renowned cold case investigator helped bring the two sides together, and the program even covered the cost of the testing. Othram developed a profile from DNA preserved on Carla's clothing and uploaded it to a public database, which pointed to the McCurley family. In July of 2020, the company gave detectives the surname, and McCurley had been on that very original 1974 list. The man cleared by a polygraph decades earlier had been the answer all along. Investigators pulled his trash, then collected a cheek swab, and both confirmed the match. The discarded household garbage gave them the first confirmation, and the swab sealed it beyond doubt. McCurley was arrested in September of 2020. 46 years after a Valentine's dance ended in tragedy, The case finally had a suspect in custody, and the family who had waited so long now had a name for their grief. Would he ever admit what he had done? McCurley went to trial in August of 2021, and on the third day, he changed his plea to guilty of capital murder. After decades of denials, he admitted in open court what the DNA had already proven. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The confession, when it came, closed a case that had defeated investigators since the 1970s and gave Carla's family the certainty they had waited a lifetime for. He died in prison in July of 2023. His case helped inspire a proposed federal law named in Carla's memory, meant to expand the use of this kind of DNA work in other cold cases around the country. What had once been an impossible case had become a model for how the science could deliver both an answer and a conviction, and a rallying point for families still waiting on cases of their own. The next case would set a record, solved with a sample so small it seemed impossible. Stephanie Isaacson. A teenager left for school one morning and never arrived. The case would be cracked decades later by one of the smallest DNA samples ever used to solve a crime. It became a milestone in forensic science, proof that even the faintest trace of evidence might one day be enough to name a killer. For more than 30 years, though, that promise meant nothing to the people who had loved her. Stephanie Isaacson was a teenager and a student at a Las Vegas high school, close with her father, who shared her love of the outdoors. On a June morning in 1989, she left home to walk to school, taking a shortcut through a vacant lot, and never made it. It was a route she knew by heart, the kind of small daily shortcut a teenager takes without a second thought. When she did not return that afternoon, her father called the school and learned she had never arrived. Her body was found that evening, not far from her usual path. A walk of just a few minutes had ended in the worst possible way. For her father, the ordinary act of expecting her home that afternoon became the beginning of a wait that would last decades. How does a teenager vanish on a short walk she made every single day? A decades-long investigation eliminated suspect after suspect, with detectives traveling the country chasing leads. Promising names came and went, each one checked and then crossed off, none of them the answer. The case stayed cold for 32 years. The trouble was the evidence itself. Only a vanishingly small amount of the killer's DNA remained, far too little for traditional testing. For decades, that tiny trace seemed like a dead end, a clue almost too small to count as one. Every conventional method investigators tried simply consumed more of the precious sample without producing a usable result. With each attempt, there was less of it left to work with. How do you build a case from almost nothing at all? Funded by a $5,000 donation from a local philanthropist, police sent the sample to Othram in early 2021. The money came from a private citizen who simply wanted to see the case solved. A reminder of how often these breakthroughs depend on outside help. Using advanced genome sequencing, the lab built a genealogical profile from only 120 picograms of DNA, fewer than 15 human cells, a record low amount for solving a crime. To put that in perspective, it was a quantity of genetic material so small that older labs would have discarded it as unusable. The lab called it a record low quantity, and its chief executive described the result as a major milestone. What had looked like far too little to work with had become enough to build an entire family tree. The achievement quickly drew national attention, held up as proof of how far the science had come. The profile led to a man named Darren Roy Marchand. His DNA from an earlier case was compared to the new profile, and it matched, and the identification was announced in July of 2021. a sample almost too small to exist, had pointed straight at one man, a name that had been in the system all along. The very evidence that had defeated investigators for 32 years now did the one thing they had always needed. Would the family finally see him answer for it? Marchand, however, had died in 1995, so there would be no trial. He had once been arrested in an earlier strangulation case that was dismissed, and the new testing tied him to that killing as well. Two cases that had haunted Las Vegas for decades were answered by the same name, a man who had slipped through the system once before. The earlier dismissal had let him walk, and the new science tied the threads together. Stephanie's mother said she was glad they had found who was responsible, but that there was no justice for Stephanie at all. The answer had come, carried by a few human cells, decades after anyone thought it possible. The case had set a record no one had set out to break, proving that even the faintest trace of evidence might one day be enough to name a killer and bring a family the truth. The next case reached even further back, to a homecoming night in 1970. Pamela Conyers. A teenager drove to a shopping mall on a fall evening and never came home. Her killer would stay hidden for more than 50 years. It was one of the oldest cold cases ever cracked by this kind of DNA work, a file that had outlasted nearly everyone who first worked it. For 5 decades, her name belonged to a list of cases that seemed destined never to close. Pamela Conyers was a teenager, a high school student and band member in Anne Arundel County, Maryland. By every account, she was an ordinary, well-liked student with the whole arc of her life still in front of her. On an October evening in 1970, she attended a homecoming event at her school, then drove to a nearby mall to run an errand, the last place she was seen alive. It was the kind of night that should have ended with her driving home and walking back through her own front door. When she did not return, her family reported her missing. Her car was found days later in a wooded area, and her body was found nearby. A festive autumn night had ended with the family's frantic search, and then their worst fear confirmed. The car that should have carried her safely home instead sat abandoned among the trees. How does a teenager disappear on a short evening errand close to home? DNA was collected from the scene in 1970, but the science to use it would not exist for decades. The evidence was carefully kept, year after year, on the chance that the future might bring a way to read it. The case stalled for more than 50 years, becoming one of the oldest unsolved cases in the county. A classmate would later recall the empty desk she left behind, a small daily reminder of a loss that never quite faded. Detectives retired, evidence aged, and still no one could say who had done it. Over the years, the file became a kind of inheritance, passed from one investigator to the next without ever yielding an answer. Each new team studied the same scene and reached the same silence. What could possibly crack a case that old? The FBI and Anne Arundel County Police turned to investigative genetic genealogy. It was the same family tree approach that had begun solving cases across the country, applied now to one of the oldest files on the books. Where a direct database search had nothing to offer, the genealogy could trace a path through distant relatives instead. In March of 2023, they announced the first suspect, a man named Forrest Clyde Williams III, who had been 21 at the time and had died in Virginia in 2018. The genealogy had reached back across half a century to a man already in his grave, someone who had never surfaced in the original investigation. He had lived a full life and died of natural causes, never once questioned about the teenager from 1970. But the story did not end with one name. Evidence was sent to Othram, which built a profile using advanced genome sequencing, and the FBI's genealogy team generated new leads from it. The first identification had pointed to one man, but the science suggested he had not acted alone. The DNA recovered from the scene appeared to carry the genetic markers of more than one different unknown contributor. In 2024, a second suspect, Donald Willard, was identified. Both men had died before they could ever be charged. The science had named them, but it had arrived too late for either to stand trial, a pattern that had become painfully familiar in these decades-old cases. Police said Williams would have been charged with murder had he lived, and his DNA was entered into the national database to check for links to other crimes. The investigation remains open, and detectives have not ruled out further involvement. Police also said the case was not connected to another infamous local crime some had long wondered about. After more than 50 years, the family finally had names. Even if a courtroom was no longer possible, the empty desk had an explanation at last, carried back across half a century by the DNA she left behind. And a case once thought permanently unsolvable had reached an end of sorts. The next case would turn on an unusual test, one that worked backward through a suspect's own child. Jeannie Moore. A young woman left home to get to work and never made it. Her case would be solved by tracing the killer through his own daughter. It was a striking example of how genetic genealogy can reach a suspect sideways through the family around him, when he himself has left no direct trail. For Jeannie's loved ones, the method offered hope where decades of conventional work had found none. Jeannie Moore was a teenager from Jefferson County, Colorado, remembered by her family as loving and kind in all her ways. She came from a close family of sisters who would carry her memory for decades. On an August day in 1981, she set out to reach her job at a gas station. The family shared a single car, so she hitchhiked. It was something she had done before, a routine necessity in a household making do with what it had. Witnesses saw her get into an older red car near the highway, and she was attacked and killed. Her body was found days later in a park. A short ride to an ordinary shift had turned into the last time her family saw her. The simple fact that the household shared one car had put her on the roadside that day, depending on a stranger's kindness. How does a young woman vanish in the middle of an ordinary morning? The case went cold for years. In 2008, it got a fresh look, and DNA collected from the scene was uploaded to the national database in 2011. But it produced no match. For her sisters, who remembered her warmth, the silence stretched on with no end in sight. The killer's genetic profile was on file, yet no name came back. The evidence was there, complete and waiting, but the database simply did not contain the man it belonged to. A direct match would only ever work if he had been arrested and entered into the system, and that match never came. What could turn that silent profile into an answer? In 2019, with funding from a local Crime Stoppers group, investigators tried forensic genetic genealogy. The same approach that had begun cracking cold cases nationwide offered a way around the dead end of a database that held no direct match. Using public databases to find relatives and a reverse paternity approach, they worked toward a single man, Donald Stephen Perea, who had been in his early 20s at the time. His biological daughter provided DNA that confirmed Perea was overwhelmingly likely to be the source of the crime scene profile. The statistical odds against anyone else being the source were astronomical, leaving almost no room for doubt. It was an unusual path to an answer, running not forward from the suspect, but backward through his own child. The genealogy that had cracked so many cases here did its work through the next generation. A daughter unknowingly holding the key to a case from before her time. Without her contribution, the trail might have stayed cold indefinitely. It was a strange kind of justice, arriving through a person who had nothing to do with the crime itself. The identification was announced in September of 2019. After 38 years, a case that had defeated the original detectives finally had a name attached to it. And the family that had waited so long finally knew. Perea, however, had died in 2012, so he would never face charges. He had a history of serious crimes and had been out on bond in another case when he killed Moore, and was later imprisoned for a time in the years that followed. The man whose profile had sat unmatched in a database for years had, it turned out, been moving through the justice system all along, just never for this. Had genetic genealogy existed in his lifetime, the outcome might have looked very different, and he might have answered for it in a courtroom. The family connected with Perea's relatives and said they held no grudges against them. It was a rare grace note in a story full of loss, one family choosing understanding over anger toward another, for a case that had gone unanswered for nearly 4 decades. The genealogy had reached its conclusion not through the suspect himself, but through the generation that came after him. It stood as a fitting illustration of just how thoroughly the new science had now changed what was possible. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.